For as long as I could remember, Evelyn had always been a part of my life. She was a familiar presence in the background, a face that belonged in my mother's world. Elegant, composed, and naturally captivating, she had a way of drawing attention without demanding it. I had seen her countless times, laughing in our living room, sipping wine with my mother on the patio, exchanging knowing glances that held secrets from a past I wasn't part of. Yet, despite her constant presence, she had always remained distant, defined by her connection to my mother rather than to me. But tonight was different. The first shift happened when the door opened, revealing Evelyn standing in the warm glow of our hallway light. Her black dress hugged her body in a way that was neither ostentatious nor modest, it was simply perfect. Soft, cascading waves of hair framed her sharp features, her deep red lips curling into a smirk as she stepped inside. "Happy birthday, Alex," she said, her voice as smooth as aged bourbon. I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. She stepped further in, and the air seemed to shift. It was subtle, the way she moved, deliberate yet effortless. As if she was perfectly aware of the way people noticed her but too accustomed to it to acknowledge it. My mother greeted her with a warm embrace, oblivious to the fact that my eyes remained fixed on Evelyn as she shrugged off her coat. The motion was unremarkable, yet somehow, it made my breath catch. Perhaps it was the way the dress clung just a little tighter as she moved, or perhaps it was something deeper, something unspoken, something I had never dared to notice before. Evelyn caught my gaze and held it, just for a second. A flicker of amusement danced in her eyes before she turned back to my mother, breaking whatever spell had momentarily settled over me. Dinner proceeded as it always did, familiar dishes, casual conversation, the rhythmic clinking of cutlery against porcelain. Yet, beneath it all, there was a tension I couldn't name. Evelyn sat across from me, her posture relaxed, yet every now and then, I caught her watching me. Not in a scrutinizing way, but in a way that felt different. Intentional. I was no longer just a boy in her peripheral vision. At one point, my mother excused herself to check on something in the kitchen, leaving us alone at the table. The room felt too quiet. The distance between us suddenly more noticeable. Evelyn swirled the wine in her glass, her fingers slender against the delicate stem. "So, 21, she mused, her gaze settling on me. "How does it feel?" I exhaled a soft laugh, shrugging. "Not much different, honestly." She tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. "No grand revelations? No sudden urge to take on the world?" "Not yet," I admitted. "Maybe I'm still waiting for the moment to hit me." She smirked, taking a slow sip of wine. "Ah, but those moments never come when you expect them." There was something about the way she said it, something that made my chest tighten. As if she were speaking from experience. As if she knew something I didn't. The conversation shifted when my mother returned, but the undercurrent of that moment lingered. Evelyn had always been a presence in my life, but tonight, she was something more. A force. A question I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. And for the first time, I realized, I couldn't stop looking at her. Dinner had been pleasant, a comforting ritual of familiar dishes and warm conversation. The wine had flowed generously, loosening tongues and bringing out nostalgic stories that made my mother laugh a little too loudly. Evelyn, as always, carried herself with effortless charm, her laughter rich and velvety. The kind that lingered even after the moment passed. Then came the moment that changed everything. It started innocently enough. My mother, her cheeks flushed from the wine, leaned back in her chair with a wistful smile. "Evelyn, do you remember your old cheerleading uniform? Everyone in school used to talk about how stunning you looked in it." Evelyn let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, I haven't thought about that in years." My mother, ever sentimental, waved a hand dismissively. I still have it, you know. Somewhere upstairs. Tucked away in one of the old boxes. I don't know what possessed me in that moment. Maybe it was the wine, maybe it was the quiet allure of Evelyn sitting across from me. Or maybe it was the way she suddenly seemed less like my mother's friend and more like someone else. Someone captivating. Why don't you try it on? The words escaped my mouth before I could think better of them. Evelyn raised a perfectly arched brow, intrigued. You're curious, aren't you? I shrugged, feigning indifference. But my pulse quickened at the way her lips curled into an amused smirk. My mother chuckled, shaking her head. Oh, don't humor him, Evelyn. That thing is ancient. Evelyn, however, was already rising from her chair, stretching slightly before tilting her head toward my mother. Actually, why not? It could be fun. My mother laughed but waved her off toward the staircase. All right, but don't blame me if it falls apart the moment you put it on. As Evelyn ascended the stairs, my heart pounded harder than I cared to admit. I tried to focus on the clinking of dishes as my mother cleared the table, but my thoughts were elsewhere. What had I just done? Minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have. Each second a quiet torment. And then the door creaked open. I turned, and for a moment, forgot how to breathe. Evelyn stepped into the dimly lit living room. The old cheerleader uniform hugging her in ways I never would have imagined. The pleated skirt swayed slightly as she moved, her posture as poised as ever, but there was a playful glint in her eyes. Well, she asked, resting a hand on her hip. Does it still suit me? I swallowed hard. You look incredible. Her smirk deepened, and for the first time that night, something shifted between us. It wasn't just playful teasing anymore. There was something else, something charged, lingering in the space between us like an unspoken challenge. My mother, oblivious to the tension, laughed. Oh, Alex looks like he's in shock. She had no idea. Because for the first time, I wasn't looking at Evelyn as my mother's friend. I was looking at her as a woman. And I was completely captivated. The air in the room had changed. Something unspoken hung between us, thickening with each passing second. Evelyn stood there, the dim light casting soft shadows over her form. The cheerleader uniform clung to her body, its fabric stretched slightly with time, yet it fit her as though it had been waiting for this very moment. I should have said something. I should have looked away. But I didn't. Evelyn, seemingly unfazed by the weight of my stare, simply walked past me with a smirk and took her seat at the table once more. My mother was still chuckling, swirling the wine in her glass, completely oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. All right, enough of the nostalgia, she said, her voice light. Let's finish off this cake before it melts. She took a forkful of the rich chocolate cake, humming in satisfaction. Evelyn followed suit, though her movements were slower, more deliberate. She slid her fork through the cake, breaking off a small bite, before lifting it to her lips. And just like that, I was undone. She didn't eat it hastily. Nor did she even appear to savor it, but something about the way her lips parted, the way the fork lingered there for just a moment before she drew it away, sent an unexpected jolt through me. Her tongue flicked briefly over the fork's edge, collecting the last traces of frosting, and I had to force myself to exhale. Evelyn caught my gaze, and for a brief second, there was something knowing in her eyes. Amusement, perhaps. A quiet dare. As if she was fully aware of what she had just done to me. I reached for my glass, taking a sip of wine in a desperate attempt to ground myself. But the warmth spreading through my chest had little to do with the alcohol. You all right, birthday boy? Evelyn's voice was smooth. Teasing. I cleared my throat. Yeah. Just warm in here. My mother, still oblivious, waved a hand dismissively. That's the wine. You always get flushed when you drink, Alex. Evelyn's lips curled into a smirk, and she took another slow bite of cake, her gaze never leaving mine. It was subtle, yet deliberate. A game she knew she was winning. I shifted in my seat, glancing away. This was ridiculous. I had known Evelyn my whole life. She was my mother's best friend. But tonight, for the first time, she felt like something else entirely. A presence. A force. A woman. I needed a distraction. Since we're on a nostalgia trip, I said, forcing a casual tone, maybe we should dig up some old photo albums too. Relive all of Mom's embarrassing fashion choices. My mother groaned. Oh, please. I had impeccable taste. Unlike you, with your ridiculous spiked hair phase. Evelyn chuckled. Spiked hair? Now that, I need to see. The tension in the air lightened, but not completely. The game was still being played, even if it was veiled beneath laughter and reminiscing. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it. My pulse still thrummed whenever Evelyn so much as lifted her fork. The room still carried the scent of chocolate cake and wine when Evelyn stretched slightly, adjusting the hem of the cheerleader uniform. My mother, still entertained by nostalgia, barely paid attention as Evelyn smoothed her hands down the fabric with a thoughtful expression. You know, she mused, tilting her head. I kept this uniform all these years without really knowing why. Maybe it's just sentimental, or maybe. She trailed off, glancing at me with a faint smile before continuing. Maybe I just wanted to remember what it felt like back then. My mother laughed lightly, swirling the last bit of wine in her glass. Well, it still looks amazing on you. Brings back memories. Doesn't it? Evelyn nodded but didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to me. Alex, how about a drive? A little birthday treat. I tensed, glancing toward my mother, who only smiled in approval. That sounds nice. I think the fresh air would do you both good after all this wine. Just don't keep him out too late, Evelyn. She grinned. I'll bring him back in one piece. Promise. And just like that, I found myself following her out to the car, my pulse already quickening. The night air was cool, the sky stretched wide above us. Stars flickering in silent witness. I climbed into the passenger seat, and as the door shut, the scent of Evelyn's perfume mixed with the lingering aroma of wine, wrapping around me like something dangerous and enticing. She drove in silence at first, the low hum of the engine filling the space between us. Then, as she pulled onto the main road, she spoke. Her voice soft yet clear. You know, back in college, whenever I wore this uniform, my ex-husband couldn't take his eyes off me. It was his weakness, she admitted with a wry chuckle. I suppose it made me feel powerful in a way. Desired. I swallowed, trying to focus on the road ahead rather than the way the fabric of the uniform hugged her legs as she shifted gears. And now? Do you still feel that way? She glanced at me, an unreadable expression dancing across her lips. Wearing it again tonight, it's strange. For a moment. I feel like I'm back in time, like I could be that girl again. Her fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel. Do you ever wonder what it's like to relive a moment just to see if it feels the same? The question hung in the air, stirring something restless inside me. I hesitated before replying, I guess it depends on the moment. Some things are worth reliving. Others. Maybe it's better they stay in the past. Evelyn chuckled, then cast me a sideways glance. So, tell me, Alex. Have you ever been in love? I hesitated, suddenly feeling exposed under her gaze. No. Not yet. Her smirk deepened. Still a boy, then? A rush of something hot and electric burned through me at her teasing words. Still a boy? The challenge in her voice struck something primal. Something instinctual, the need to prove otherwise. Maybe, I admitted, leaning back in my seat, my voice dropping just slightly. Or maybe I just haven't met someone who made me want to grow up yet. Evelyn laughed at that, a low, knowing sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The combination of her perfume, the soft glow of the dashboard lights on her skin, and the wine still buzzing through my veins made the moment feel surreal, almost intoxicating. I decided to push the moment further. Tell me, how did your ex-husband win you over back then? What was his trick? Evelyn raised a brow, clearly amused. Why do you ask? I smirked. Maybe I just want to see if it still works. She tilted her head slightly, a slow smile forming on her lips. Are you asking me to let you play his role? I didn't back down. Why not? It's just a game, right? For a moment, she only studied me, the flickering streetlights casting shadows across her face. Then, with a knowing glint in her eyes, she gave me a small, deliberate wink. All right, Alex. Let's play. The drive-in theater was nearly empty, the flickering glow from the screen illuminating Evelyn's face in shifting light and shadow. The low hum of the distant film mixed with the soft rustling of fabric as she shifted in her seat. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, blending with the last traces of wine, creating an intoxicating atmosphere that neither of us could escape. Evelyn exhaled, her fingers idly playing with the hem of her skirt. You know, Alex, she murmured. Her voice soft but laden with something heavier, the last time I wore this uniform, I was sitting in a car just like this. I turned to look at her, captivated by the way her lips curved into a faint smile, as if she were reliving something distant yet impossibly close. With your ex-husband? I asked, my voice lower now. She nodded, tracing the fabric of her skirt absent-mindedly. It was our first time. Right here. In a car just like this. My pulse quickened. The thought of Evelyn, younger, filled with anticipation, experiencing something so intimate in the very outfit she was wearing now sent a shiver down my spine. But it wasn't just the memory itself, it was the way she spoke about it. As if that moment was bleeding into this one, as if history was repeating itself, and she wasn't sure whether to stop it or surrender to it. And now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Do you feel the same? She studied me for a long moment, her gaze searching, questioning. Then, slowly, she exhaled. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling just slightly. Maybe I just want to feel it again. Something inside me snapped. The space between us had been closing steadily, but now, it vanished altogether. The invitation in her words was too much to resist. My fingers reached for her, brushing against the soft skin of her thigh where the skirt had ridden up. A small hitch in her breath told me everything I needed to know. She didn't pull away. I cupped her face, my thumb running over her parted lips before I leaned in. Her breath was warm against my skin, mingled with the remnants of wine, before I finally kissed her. It started slow, hesitant, but the moment her hands found my shoulders, gripping tightly, the hesitation disappeared. Evelyn's body melted into mine with an intensity that made the world outside the car fade into insignificance. Her hands slid slowly down my chest, her fingertips brushing lightly against the fabric of my shirt, as though she were tracing the lines of desire that had been building between us. Her nails grazed over the material, delicate yet deliberate, testing the boundaries we both knew were already crumbling under the weight of our shared longing. The uniform she had been so casually adjusting just minutes ago now felt like an unnecessary barrier, a relic of formality that stood in stark contrast to the raw connection sparking between us. My own hands moved instinctively, my fingers trailing down her back, following the graceful curve of her spine with a touch that was both tender and urgent. When I reached the small of her back, I pressed gently but firmly, pulling her closer until there was no space left between us. She shifted in response, her legs finding their place around me. And suddenly she was straddling me in the confined, intimate space of the car. The closeness was overwhelming. The air thick with unspoken words and the electricity of a moment that had been building for what felt like forever. Her breath mingled with mine, her warmth seeping into me, and for that brief, suspended instant, nothing else existed beyond the two of us. She let out a soft, involuntary gasp against my lips, the sound muffled but filled with unspoken longing. Her fingers gently tangled into my hair, tightening slightly as I deepened the kiss, our breath mingling in the charged space between us. My hands began to wander, drifting lower until they brushed over the smooth, exposed skin of her bare thighs. Slowly, I inched my fingers upward, sliding them beneath the soft, pleated fabric that clung to her hips. She responded instantly, her body arching toward mine as if drawn by an irresistible pull, pressing herself closer with a sense of urgency that made my pulse quicken. Her breath grew uneven, ragged, as her own hands began to explore, moving with a deliberate yet tender curiosity. They slipped beneath the hem of my shirt, her fingertips grazing my skin in a way that sent shivers racing through me. Each touch left a trail of heat in its wake, igniting a fire that spread across my body. The intensity of her touch matched my own, our movements synchronized in a dance of shared desire. Every press of her lips, every shift of her body, seemed to speak volumes, as if words were no longer necessary. We were lost in the moment. The world around us fading into insignificance as we clung to each other, our connection deepening with every passing second. The car was thick with tension, the air heavy with shallow breaths that seemed to echo in the confined space. The friction of bodies shifting and pressing against each other created a palpable heat, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Every movement was deliberate, charged with an urgency that neither of us could deny. Evelyn's hands were impatient yet tender, her fingers grasping at the fabric of my shirt, tugging insistently until it yielded, sliding up and over my head. The cool air of the car brushed against my exposed skin, but it did nothing to quell the fire building between us. Her touch was deliberate, her fingers tracing the contours of my chest with a slow, almost reverent precision, as if she were memorizing every line and curve. Then, with a soft exhale, she leaned in, her lips meeting my collarbone in a kiss that sent an electric surge through my body, igniting every nerve. The last fragments of restraint, already fragile, shattered completely, leaving us both consumed by the raw, unfiltered need that had been simmering beneath the surface. I groaned softly, my hands slipping beneath the hem of her top, fingers grazing the warmth of her skin beneath. She shivered almost imperceptibly under my touch, her body responding instinctively, her own hands moving with deliberate purpose to undo the buttons of my jeans. There was no hesitation now, no pause to question or doubt, only the undeniable pull between us. The heat that seemed to intensify with every breath we shared. The air around us was thick with the sound of soft sighs and muffled moans, a symphony of longing as clothing was shed piece by piece, each layer discarded until there was nothing left to separate us but the raw intensity of the moment. Evelyn pulled back slightly, just enough to meet my gaze, her eyes dark and unfocused, her pupils blown wide with desire. Her breath hitched as she whispered my name, Alex. Her voice trembling, barely steady. It wasn't a warning, not a plea for restraint, it was an invitation. A silent permission that spoke volumes. In that single word, she conveyed everything I needed to know, everything I had been waiting for. And with that, the last shred of distance between us vanished, dissolved in the heat of the moment. Our bodies finally aligned, no barriers left to navigate, no hesitation to hold us back. The space between us was filled only with the electric connection that had been building, the culmination of every glance, every touch, every shared breath. The world outside ceased to exist. And there was only us, caught in the fire of our shared desire, surrendering completely to the moment. The night had long settled into silence, the remnants of heat lingering in the air, heavy with something neither of us had the words to define. The car had become still. The world outside a vast emptiness, punctuated only by the occasional flickering of distant headlights on the highway. Evelyn sat beside me, her breath slow and measured. Her gaze distant as she traced small, absent-minded patterns on the dashboard with her fingertips. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The weight of what had just transpired lingered between us. Neither regretful nor fully understood. It had happened. There was no taking it back. I turned to look at her, the dim light of the dashboard casting shadows across her face, highlighting the curve of her lips, the slight furrow in her brow. She looked lost in thought, lost in the lingering aftermath of something neither of us had quite expected to unfold the way it had. Finally, she sighed, shifting slightly in her seat. "Alex, what are we doing?" The question hung between us, heavy, unanswerable. I exhaled, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel before relaxing. "I don't know," I admitted. "Do you?" She let out a soft laugh. One that lacked humor but was filled with something else, something I couldn't quite name. "No," she murmured. "I don't." For a long moment, neither of us spoke again. The weight of the past hours pressed down on us, and yet, in some unexplainable way, it felt like neither of us wanted to move. Like stepping out of the car would make everything real. Would force us to confront whatever this was, whatever we had just become. She turned to look at me then, really look at me. "Are you going to regret this?" I considered her question carefully, knowing that whatever I said now would carry more weight than any words I had spoken before. Regret? The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. "No," I answered honestly. "Are you?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together before she shook her head. "No. But that doesn't make it any less complicated." I nodded, understanding her words even if I didn't want to. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for my hand, her fingers lacing through mine, warm and hesitant. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe we don't have to figure it all out tonight." I exhaled, a quiet sense of relief settling in my chest. "Yeah. Maybe not tonight." A comfortable silence settled between us then, the kind that only comes when two people have reached a mutual understanding, even if that understanding is built on uncertainty. The future was still a vast, uncharted expanse, filled with questions neither of us had the answers to. But for now, none of that mattered. For now, there was only this, only the quiet hum of the night, the warmth of her hand in mine, and the unspoken promise that whatever came next, we would face it together.